Hello everybody and welcome to another vlog from your friends in the PI and clinical negligence groups at number 5 Chambers. Today we're going to be talking about our experiences of virtual ADR, which is to cover virtual mediations and also virtual JSMs. With me I have Mr. Henry Pitchers QC. Say hello, Henry.
Good morning.
Richard Moat.
Good morning.
And our very special guest, I'm delighted to welcome, is Paul Balen from Trust Mediation, who's going to give us his views as a very experienced mediator and how these things are working and how you can best facilitate them for your clients. So just to give everyone a sense to start off with, Paul, I know you would have been very busy since lockdown, but Henry, first of all, and then Richard, how many of sort of these virtual ADR mediations, JSMs have you been doing since lockdown? How popular have they been?
Well, I haven't done any mediations. I think there were about 2 cases that were supposed to be done by mediation. One of those was right at the start of the lockdown, and in fact it was the mediator who refused to do it remotely. The other one was just cancelled because it was felt that the mediation virtually wasn't going to work. But I've actually had lots of JSMs. I've done, I think, more than 12 in total for claimants and defendants since the lockdown. So lots of experience of virtual JSMs, no experience of a remote mediation.
Richard?
Yes, well, I can't match Henry in terms of his prolific output with respect to JSM. I suspect most barristers in the population can't. But I've done 4 JSMs and I perhaps score one advantage today in having done one virtual mediation, which involved a £1.5 million claim on employer's liability involving a claimant and 3 defendants.
Okay. Let's go to you then, Paul. In terms of tips and advice for parties thinking about a virtual mediation and how to prepare for them, how do you like things to be organised? And just talk us through the sort of technology and the platforms that people need to get to grips with.
Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you for inviting me into your party. We at Trust Mediation can adapt to whatever platforms the parties would like to use within reason, but we'll lobby quite hard to provide the platform so that we can control the whole process as an independent neutral. Currently, we have express authority from National Health Service resolution to use the Zoom platform, which we believe is the closest single platform that provides the equivalent to meeting in the real world with its breakout rooms and so on, which we will control. But we can also mediate on Teams and have done, Microsoft Teams, and on Starleaf. The slight difference with those is that effectively you have to run 2 or 3 meetings at the same time, as opposed to everyone being on the same platform, and I as mediator just moving people around into plenary sessions and breakout rooms as appropriate.
Okay. Have you encountered any difficulties with firms of solicitors or other organisations having preferences for certain technology or not being allowed to use others? Is that starting to settle down now, or is that still a problem? Because I've had that problem with the JSM, with the NHSR, in fact, saying they weren't allowed to use, it was Zoom or Microsoft Teams or something.
In the early days, certainly there was a problem, and certainly Zoom started off with a pretty bad reputation suddenly, but for lack of security. Our understanding is that's all tightened up, and we, as a company, have a policy on how we should make the platform secure. So if we're using Zoom, we'll use a waiting room so we can check people in. We'll lock down the platform where everyone is on the platform. We'll ban recording, and we check that the server is in the EEC, which now it usually is, so we comply with all GDPR requirements. But we can and have mediated on 2 separate platforms at the same time. If people are resolute in their opposition to one particular platform and another party particularly want to use a platform. And in fact, I've got 2 screens on my desk, and I did one mediation with one party on one screen, one on the other. And when it's settled, I just turned the screens together so they could talk to each other on their different platforms.
Right.
One other advantage with Zoom is you can actually join Zoom on a conference call. So I've had parties who don't have a video camera or for some reason are banned from using a video camera, actually take part in the full mediation, albeit I can't see them and they can't see anybody else, but they are there and I can move them around in and out of breakout rooms and so on, even though they're just on the end of the telephone.
Yeah, I think just on that point, Richard, from my point of view, I think it's important to make sure that the client, who obviously is supposed to be, or the claimant, who's supposed to be at the centre of this process, is familiar with the technology, and it's quite important to make sure you touch base with them beforehand. What was your experience of that when you did your mediation?
Well, it's a very difficult problem, isn't it? Because a lot of clients in these situations are not very computer literate. And I have to say, my client in the mediation I did relied very much on his solicitor and his solicitor assisting him with respect to setting matters up. He did not want to get involved in video calls or anything of that sort of nature. But I have seen with respect to other settlement meetings, yes, I think it's absolutely critical that if the claimant is going to take part in an active way with respect to the mediation, that they practice in advance. And indeed it is for the solicitors, counsel and mediator themselves in terms of making sure that everybody is singing out of the same hymn sheet insofar as technology is concerned. I think preparation is increasingly the important part of making sure that mediations and settlement meetings work as well as they possibly can. You have to be very, very well organised. You can't, on the day, go back and do things in the way that you could do if perhaps you had the full facilities of a solicitor's office and a counsel's chambers there. And I think that's absolutely critical for people to bear in mind in terms of organising in advance.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And just on a final point on that, in terms of the bundle for a mediator, if we're talking about a mediation, Paul, my understanding is even more so than with virtual court hearings, it's really important not to overburden you with too much information and make sure it's in a form that you can easily access. Is that right?
Yes, I always say less is more. I just need to know the certain core documents that will help me understand the background and the tension points. I like an index that's hyperlinked so that I have easier access to the documents. Most firms these days know where to lodge electronically documents. One or other firm will have a secure platform, but if they don't, we as a company, mediation company, offer our own secure platform that the parties can use if they so wish. But in my experience, that they have their own ways of doing it. I think the other thing on preparation is we definitely in the virtual world spend more time with the parties before the mediation. There's the usual pre-mediation telephone call, but nowadays I put a lot of pressure on the parties to experience the platform that I'm going to mediate on for themselves. I'll give them a guided tour, take them into their breakout rooms, and often after I've shown them how they ask for the mediator to come and join them and so on, offer to leave them there while I have a pre-mediation conference. So probably I'm spending an hour or two with each party before the mediation's even taken place.
Yeah.
Jamie, just on preparation, I agree 100% with what's just been said and the points that Richard makes about testing out the technology, and on the claimant side, obviously being sensitive to there being a range of abilities in terms of the technology. But I think, again, there's extra need to prepare claimants, at least, for the differences in a remote negotiation, a remote mediation or joint settlement meeting. So I think the need to try and manage their expectations, given that there's a risk of them feeling somewhat disconnected during the process, is even greater now we're doing these things remotely.
Yeah, I agree. Let's look then at some of the things we think have worked well with these sort of virtual mediations and JSMs, and some things that have been a challenge. Henry, first of all, in your experience, is there anything that actually, if anything, works better about these sort of virtual mediations in these cases, or not?
Yeah, I mean, this is a sense I've got that the other parties, and particularly the lawyers involved, just seems to be a bit more businesslike. There's a sort of friendly but professional and focused approach that I've encountered. There's been less of that, pointless blustering or taking silly positions. It seems to have been more focused, and that just may have been the ones that I've done, but the sense I've had is that people have got on with things and there's been less messing around. Doesn't always mean you settle, but it means that you find out if you're going to settle or not, perhaps earlier than you might otherwise have done, and more painlessly.
Yeah, I agree. It's my experience as well. It certainly, I think, seems a bit more odd to try and grandstand for the benefit of your instructing solicitor when you're sat in your study at home somehow. So maybe that's part of it. Richard, what's your experience of that? Are you finding people having to make the effort?
I agree. I mean, I think what is difficult is to work out how much people are being more realistic because there's likely to be a delay in cases because of COVID, and how much the parties that are coming to litigation are actually enthusiastic about trying to use the process to reach a settlement of the claim, as opposed to feeling that they might be being forced into it, as opposed to a trial that was, say, just about to take place and then hasn't managed to go ahead because of COVID.
Sure. Paul, I think your experience is that actually for some clients, psychologically or even physically, the sort of ability to do this sort of a meeting at home can actually be easier for them in some cases. Is that right?
Yes, well, our experience is that actually from the vast majority of the participants, and that's the professionals as well as the lay people, the whole atmosphere seems to me to be much more relaxed. People are in an environment that they're well used to. On the claimant side, they're at home, and it's part of my role to make people much more relaxed as well. And I'm always sending people off to make themselves a cup of coffee, or say, look, it's coming up to lunchtime. You're not going to have the plate of sandwiches from number 5 chambers provided for you. Go off and make yourself some sandwiches, have a cup of coffee. I'll come back, or I'll guarantee not to come back into your room, till 1:30 or whatever it is. And time, if you remove the stress of travel and the deadlines of travel, I must get a train by so-and-so, or, I've had trouble parking and I'm flustered and goodness knows what else. It's amazing the difference that makes. Mediations, I'm given a start time, but that's virtually meaningless because I'll open the virtual platform whenever the parties want to join in, that they might want a pre-mediation chat before I get involved. I always try and stagger the parties arriving on the site anyway. I think that's good practice. And people can dip in and out. So if you're, for example, representing a defendant, you don't have to have someone from the client trust or someone from NHS resolution online all day, as you would in the real world where they have to travel and be in the room with you. You can arrange certain times, or say, I'll give you a ring when I need you to pop back in. And providing the mediator is alerted, in our case, certainly, because we would need to unlock the platform to allow the person back in, that can work really well. They can go off and do the rest of the work or see patients, whatever it is, and then pop back in at an opportune time.
Great. All right. Well, that's some of the good things. Let's have a think about some of the challenges that some of us have experienced as well. I mean, one of the things for me, which hasn't yet become a big issue, but I'm slightly aware of, is the ability to manage clients in emotionally challenging cases. It seems to me video is a lot better than telephone in that. I've done a couple by telephone, which can be more difficult. I think telephone's only really suited to more straightforward cases where clients are happy to deal with it in that way. But clearly, while video is better, it doesn't seem to me to be quite as good as being face-to-face sometimes with somebody. Richard, first of all, is that your experience as well, or have you found it?
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. I think if you're not in the same room as somebody else, there is a very, very slight disconnect. And I think a lot of confidence that clients have in reaching settlements in cases, if you're acting for claimants, comes down to confidence in the legal team. And I think it's more easy to have the confidence if you see and feel and touch the people. I grant everybody is getting so much better in dealing with these virtual meetings. And I think that that is something that, if it kept going, might well change. But I still think at the moment, for an awful lot of people who are perhaps not as confident with technology as now most barristers and solicitors are, I do think it makes a difference.
What about you, Henry? Do you think there's anything lost by not being in the room where it happens, to quote Hamilton?
Yeah, you know, I agree entirely with Richard about the risk of, on the claimant side particularly, a feeling of disconnection to the process. I think there's also the dealings with the other side, where you lose those non-verbal cues when you're speaking just to a face on a screen. So I think sometimes it's harder to sense the mood of the opposition and, you know, the strength of feeling as to their position. That's a relatively small point, I think, compared to dealing with the claimants. But I think there is certainly something lost in not being able to sit in a room with opposing counsel or with a solicitor and counsel on the other side, which you can't quite replicate by doing things by video.
Okay. Finally, I just want to have a think about how successful this process has been. I think we could all agree that it's been at the minimum, a very useful substitute to the simple inability to do these things in person, and for me anyway, using video conferencing and platforms such as this, both for normal conferences and ADR, has been pretty eye-opening, and something I'm sure is going to continue into the future. But in terms of success rates, like mine, I've done a number of these, they've all been settled, but that can sometimes be the nature of the case. Henry and Richard, first of all, what's your experience of whether there's been any noticeable difference in whether cases are settling or not?
The success rates have been good. It's not been 100%. I think on balance, I'd say the success rates unaffected by, in my experience at least, it's been unaffected by the fact we've done these things remotely, which is obviously in a sense good news. I haven't had any cases where I felt we would have settled had we been in person in chambers.
I'd say from my personal experience, but obviously it's limited to the cases I've done, that the success rate, if anything, has gone up. But I'm not sure whether that's the success of virtual mediation or JSMs or the like, as much as the fact that not knowing when the end of litigation is a big driver towards a number of claimants wanting to reach settlements in cases.
Yeah. Paul, I think you, Paul, have had a slightly different experience in terms of resolution, but that may be slightly to do with the vagaries of some of the instructions you're getting. Do you want to just talk us through that?
Well, yes. I mean, I've done 15 remote mediations so far. The resolution rate is currently, I think, 75%, although I don't necessarily know the outcome, because I think the slight difference I've found is that the parties who need authority to settle may not find it easy to come to the mediation at the moment with either sufficient authority or flexibility to adapt to the circumstances found on the day as quickly as they found it in the real world, simply because most of my mediations are clinical negligence. So whichever, whether it's Wales or England, the health authorities have found the lines of communication pretty stretched. And I'm sure that as they've adapted to technology, as everyone else will do, that resolution rate will come up again. I mean, 75% is still pretty reasonable, but certainly, you know, I've been working on something like 85% in the real world. We've also been doing mediations at pretty short notice where the trial has gone off because it couldn't be held because of COVID, and the parties have said, well, let's mediate, let's try and resolve it, but have come in adversarial mode with the trial bundle and haven't given sufficient thought to what does it take to resolve this case. And on occasions when that's happened, I felt I'm doing little more than pressing buttons on my computer to move people around. They're not yet in a position where they're listening to each other.
Yeah, I mean, that's useful to know. All right. Finally, then, do we think there's a place for still doing these sort of ADRs by the virtual method once, if, when things get back to normal again, or do you think they will disappear? Henry, first of all.
I think we'll very much largely return to doing these in person, which I think my sense is very much like to be preferable. But I can see there'll be some exceptional cases where there's impediments to travel or whatever, where at least some of the parties may be attending virtually. But I think when we're able to, we all are keen to just get back to doing it how we always used to.
Paul, do you have any views on that?
Yeah, I'm not so sure I agree with that. I think it's here to stay, and it wouldn't surprise me if a reasonable proportion, it may not be the majority, but the reasonable proportion will be held. It's a huge saving in costs. If you multiply the hours and the travel costs that are saved by doing it virtually, and the less stressful, certainly for the individual litigants, and the flexibility, as I've said, of certain parties to flit in and out rather than cross the country for a full day just sitting there and probably only saying 2 words. I think in time, when the whole thing works its way through, I expect, I'm not a day-to-day litigator anymore, but I expect the court process to contain a large volume of virtual hearings and so on. I think the same in the ADR world, and certainly I can see platforms increasingly adapting to create an even better environment than they've managed to achieve in the last 3 or 4 months.
Okay, well, I'll resist the urge to ask Richard to mediate between the two of your positions. I have to leave it there. So it just remains for me to thank everyone who's joined me today. Henry Pitchers, Richard Moat, and our special guest, Paul Balen from Trust Mediation. Thank you very much for joining us. And thank you for watching, and we'll see you again on the next one. Take care, everybody.